When you're training for any realistic environment or defensive shooting, it's really important to, as often as you can, train with some kind of a reactive target. There are a lot of different types of reactive targets, and the idea is not just to represent a threat, but represent the response of that threat when you are shooting at it. In other words, you don't know how many shots it's going to take for you to stop your next threat. If you always shoot 2 shots into a piece of paper or 3 shots into a piece of paper, or even just shoot random numbers of shots into a piece of paper, as I personally recommend, you still don't get the benefit of recognizing when a threat has ceased to be a threat, or specifically when a threat has gone down, which is going to be the most likely scenario to end a threat of lethal proportions. Something like a reactive steel target is a great option for reaction when you want to simulate a threat. By setting the lean angle of this piece of steel, you can actually get it to fall down after a random number of shots. Maybe it'll never fall down, or maybe you'll have to hit it several times very quickly in succession in order to knock it back and drive it all the way down to the floor. Here at the Valhalla Training Center, primarily we use 3-dimensional mannequins that clearly represent threats. This gives us a much higher level of realism, a better behavioral response as you go through our scenario sections, or even here on the square range, responding to something that clearly represents a threat. With the firearm extended towards you, 3-dimensional target area, and again, after an undetermined number of shots, a realistic reaction of the threat ceasing, which you can clearly recognize and then move on from. At home, you may not have either option. You may not financially be able to justify the investment in this type of target. You may not have a setting or an environment where you can use this type of target. At your range, you may be prohibited for legal or political reasons from shooting at humanoid type targets like the mannequin, which we prefer to use here. Something like this box can represent, in a lot of the most important ways, these types of reactive targets, and yet it's politically neutral and relatively inexpensive to build. Once you have the hinge mechanism in the base, you simply assemble 2x4 rubber sheet and then the box. The reason the rubber sheet's important is because that's what actually creates the friction and the drag on the bullet to transfer the energy to the hinge mechanism, so that when you shoot this area, what you're actually going to end up with is enough friction so that the target will fall down. When you put that piece of rubber plate in, it's important to put that in an area that represents a combat accurate hit on a imagined threat. You wouldn't want to put it down low, you wouldn't want to put it really high, and you probably wouldn't want to put it over the entire length of the box that's representing that threat, but put it in that combat accurate area, the high center chest area for us. One thing you might want to do is actually designate that area very clearly with some kind of a marking. And remember, your threat's 3-dimensional, so when you identify that area, you want to make sure that you can shoot the target from something other than straight on, particularly if you were shooting in defense of others, or if during the critical incident that threat was no longer squared off to you, but maybe shooting from the side, and you had to return fire into that area. What you'd want to do is be able to represent that anywhere in the box. When you got those hits, the threat goes down, you cease fire, and you're training in a very realistic way with a relatively inexpensive reactive target. There are certain fundamentals that apply to firearms handling regardless of what we're doing with the gun. Sport shooting, educational purposes, or even training. But once you've made the decision to have a firearm for personal defense, you should handle your firearm in a consistent, advanced way that makes you more efficient and more effective if you need to use the firearm to defend yourself. We're going to talk about a lot of different techniques that you can use for reloading, clearing a malfunction, having your firearm in your hand in a ready position, preparing to take a shot if you need to, going to and from the holster. All of these techniques will be designed so that you can efficiently use your firearm to defend yourself or others in the gravest extreme. Once you put the firearm in your hand and it's out of the holster or the case or the pack, the safe, you need to have a consistent interaction with it. Having a good, firm grip, one that keeps your fingers parallel around the front, holds the firearm high on the grip, your thumb is high on the offside, and of course, your trigger finger is off the trigger until you're ready to shoot or you need to shoot. This is the most important part of the interaction with the firearm. In fact, this is the basis of how you interact with the firearm when you need to use it. Anytime the firearm is out of the holster, you need to have a good, consistent grip. There, of course, are going to be times when you're doing administrative functions like cleaning the firearm, for example, where you won't need to have this grip. But when you're training, when you're shooting, when you're practicing your tactics, when you're thinking about scenarios, when you're on the range for a training purpose with a personal defense firearm, you should have the firearm in a good firing grip until you go back to the holster, and then you can relax. Consistency is a very important part of your advanced pistol handling. We want to make sure that we're integrating consistently with the firearm. For example, we want to do as much as we can here in the ready position. We don't want to do things out here. We don't want to do things up here. We want to do them in the ready position here as consistently as we can, because this is where we're ultimately going to present the firearm to engage a target, or it's going to come through that position from the holster or wherever it is that we're storing the gun. We want to be here in that high compressed ready position. So we want to make sure we can do all of our weapons handling skills here. One of the most fundamental weapons handling things that we're going to do is to get the gun into battery, insert a loaded magazine, clear a malfunction, whatever it is, and then get the firearm out of this condition and into battery so that we can actually fire rounds. Well, traditionally, a lot of firearms have slide releases. And as you can see, this Glock has a slide release, which is an aftermarket addition to this design. The original design of the Glock has a slide lock lever. And so we see slide releases, slide lock levers, or in the case of something like this Walther PPK, which has neither a slide release or a slide lock lever. There is no mechanical mechanism to get the slide to go in the battery other than to insert a loaded magazine, which of course this one is not, insert a loaded magazine and then rack the slide manually. And then of course we decock, go off safe, and we'd be ready to use this firearm for defense. So what's important to remember is that because firearms are going to be inconsistent, we need to have one way to interact with them. Take a look at this Beretta. The Beretta has a very prominent slide release, and it's very easy to hit for most people with the thumbs because it comes a great deal far back into the grip area. So because it comes back, it's easy to hit with that thumb. And we see a lot of people get very used to this. A lot of my military students, for example, who are issued this firearm, get very used to inserting a magazine and hitting that button. Some of them even get used to inserting a magazine and hitting it with their offhand, which is really a bad habit because we don't know that we're going to have this available to us. We might be doing one-handed reloads, for example, where the firearm's in the holster when we insert a magazine and we come out. We need to be able to hit that with our one hand. We need to be able to decock, of course, with our good firing hand, because this hand may be busy after we've shot, controlling someone or dealing with a situation. We need to make sure we're using one hand to manipulate the firearm. So that's one important part of consistency, is that we should use one hand to manipulate the firearm whenever possible. Part of that is understanding the friction necessary to rack the slide. So if we want to use our holster or our belt, we have a one-handed reload, and I'm in my holster and I insert the magazine, get my good firing grip on the firearm, and then turn around and use your belt. Your belt buckle is a great place to rack the slide, decock, and then be ready to go. So again, we can do it with one hand. The important point being as consistent as we can, using one hand that we know we'll have on the gun. If we're going to shoot the gun strong-handed, we know that that hand is going to be on the gun. Using that hand to manipulate the firearm as much as we can, and being consistent so that if we always insert that magazine and rack overhand, we know that it's going to work with any firearm. It's going to work even with this 1911, for example. For a lot of people, the width of the 1911 grip makes it impossible for them to hit that slide release without adjusting their grip in some way, actually having to turn your hand around the gun to hit the slide release lever. Again, why bother? If we have two hands, we've done our normal reload, reach up, rack the slide, safety on, or engage the target at that point. So by using this as simply a slide lock lever and not a slide release, what we do is we encourage consistency to insert, overhand rack, and then either safety, decock, or engage our threat. We want to try to do that whenever we can. So throughout this video, you won't be seeing the slide lock lever or the slide release being used. You'll see overhand manipulation, which is consistent with our ready position, because we can do it in here close. It's consistent with malfunction clearing, consistent with everything we want to do to get this firearm back into battery. And of course, we don't want a slingshot. We don't want to extend the gun away from our body, which we have to. We can't slingshot in here very reliably. People come out here and they think it's very easy or very fast. Well, there's a difference between fast and easy and efficient. Efficient is to be up here and consistent and to go overhand. The last concern I want to address, we'll go back to the Beretta. A lot of people are worried about turning on a slide-mounted safety or decocker when they go overhand. Well, the trick to that is to keep in contact with the gun. We're going to insert that magazine in, rotate the hand up, come up under that wing, under that little ear that's sitting there, and that's going to get us into a position where we can decock or we can engage the target in single action mode. So staying close to the gun is also more efficient, keeps us in constant contact. We're not going to hit, come off, and then push down on the top of the gun, which can result in that safety being on, which obviously would be a very dangerous situation. So we want to be consistent and careful in our training so that we are ultimately being as efficiently as we can when it comes to our advanced pistol handling. When it comes to advanced firearms handling, it's important that you familiarize yourself with a variety of different types of firearms. You presumably want to be able to pick up any firearm when the need arises or there happens to be one there that is of a configuration you haven't practiced with, and then you're in a lot of trouble. You have a firearm, you have training, but the two don't go hand in hand because the firearm was of a different configuration than the one you practiced with. Between revolvers, double action, double single action, safe action type pistols, and single action type pistols, there are often some very specific maneuvers and techniques that you have to employ to engage a threat with a particular type of firearm or a particular group of firearms. Let's take a really good look at the single action firearm. This firearm actually has a lever which needs to be manipulated manually with the thumb in order to allow the firearm to be fired, and then once again to render it safe afterwards so that you can come back into the ready position and eventually reholster or place the firearm in a safe place. The timing on activating this safety off or on is going to be during your actual presentation. Whether you're coming from the holster or from the ready position, as the firearm is extended out into your line of sight, you're going to disengage the safety so that you can touch and press the trigger. Then you're actually, as you bring the firearm back in, going to put the safety back on so that you're never back in the ready position with a firearm that is off safe. This is not a place you want to have a firearm with a single action trigger that isn't on safe. At this point, as you extend, you're always going to be flipping that safety off. As you come back in, you're always going to be turning it on. If for some reason you left it off, you might extend and just out of trained habit to move your thumb one way or another, put the safety back on and be at extension with a firearm that you can't shoot when you obviously need to. The other thing that can happen, obviously, by having a firearm that's off safe in the ready position would be an unintentional or negligent discharge because you're used to the firearm being on safe back here. The truth is you should never have your finger or anything else anywhere near the trigger when you're back in the ready position or going back to the holster. But because of the light, short, crisp trigger pull on the single action firearm, it's important to have this safety and to keep it on when you are doing anything except at extension shooting to engage a threat. Take a look at it two-handed and you'll see it's exactly the same. Now let's take a look at a double single action firearm. The particular gun here, the Beretta 92, needs to have this particular lever here manipulated down and back up after each string of fire as you come back into the ready position. Also, you'll notice that there is a much longer, heavier trigger pull on a double action firearm. You still don't want to start the trigger pull until you're at extension. We extend, fire our string of fire. As we come back in, our firing hand thumb is going to rotate that lever down and back up. This puts the firearm back into a double action mode. Just like with the single action where we wouldn't want to be back in our ready position with a single action firearm off safe, we don't want to be back in our ready position with this single action firearm off safe either. And the way we do that is decocking on the way back in. That's when the action happens. We don't have to do anything on the way out, but we have to decock on the way back in. That's the way you use this firearm safely and properly. Again, it's important to remember that every particular pistol is going to have a different configuration of these levers, whether it be a safety or a decocker. You need to make sure that you've practiced with your firearm. For instance, here on the SIG, as opposed to where the decocking lever was up on the slide on the Beretta, on this SIG model, the decocking lever is actually here in front of the slide release lever. So with this particular firearm, as we extend out and shoot, we put the firearm into a single action mode, and as we come back in, we may or may not be able to reach that lever as we come back in smoothly. Some people would like to do this with their offhand. I prefer to prepare for a one-handed shooting environment also and just cant my finger and the hands around the firearm as I come around and allow me to reach that lever one-handed as well as two-handed. If you were to always practice with your offhand and suddenly this hand were doing something else or injured or unavailable to help with the decocking, again, you'd be in here with a firearm that was in single action mode without an efficient, convenient way to decock because you hadn't trained in a convenient, consistent, and most importantly, efficient way. It's one thing to go to the range and unpack your gun case, get the firearm out, stand at a podium, do your shooting and training, and put it back in the case and leave. But the reality of personal defense with firearms often includes a holster. So working to and from your holster is going to be an important part of your advanced firearms handling. When you go to the range, you want to put your holster on in a way that you would actually carry it realistically if you were legally able to carry a firearm for your defense and you chose to do so, whether it was in your home or out in public. Simply draping something over the holster may be enough to conceal it. But this particular holster in my body size and as tight as this shirt is, it really isn't a good option for me at this point. If I were going to carry this firearm in this holster, which is a very good configuration for concealed carry for self-defense, I'd have a jacket on over it covering this area. It would also be covering my extra magazine as well. Once you've determined how you're going to carry your firearm for personal defense, that's the way you want to train. In this case, strong side hip carry using a Kydex holster that features a manually operated retention button that I'm going to push in to release the firearm so that it can come up and out. This particular holster automatically re-engages its retention when the firearm goes back into the holster, requiring you to push in again to release the firearm so that it can come straight up out of the holster. And this is going to be the third step in presentation from a holster. Of course, the first step for any presentation from the holster is going to be having recognized a threat and the need to shoot. If there are other options, such as telling someone that stop, you'll give them the wallet, for instance, they're asking for it, and no one's going to get hurt. You can, of course, report the crime and replace the things in the wallet. That's a better option than having to draw a firearm and engage in lethal force with someone. But if you have no other option, and you've recognized that need to respond with lethal force, that's the first step. When you recognize the need to use lethal force and you've decided cognitively to do it, you come back to your firearm and get a good grip on the firearm. That's the second step in the process. Recognition and then grip. When you grip the firearm, you're going to want to defeat any of the retention devices that the holster has holding that firearm in. In this case, pushing in on the button, maybe breaking a thumb snap, rolling a hood, or whatever other combination of things you need to do so that all you need to do now at this point is pull the firearm straight up out of the holster. Pulling the firearm straight up out of the holster allows you to prepare to orient the firearm towards the threat. In this case, we're going to assume the threat is in front of me and the firearm orients in that direction as efficiently as we can. We wouldn't want to swing the firearm out, for instance, so that it takes a long time to get the muzzle oriented towards the threat. We're going to orient it right here. Then we're going to extend through our ready position, get a two-handed grip if appropriate, extend out fully, and this is where we would then touch the trigger and press the trigger. Once you've recognized that you don't need to shoot anymore, the firearm would come back into the ready position where you continue to assess. When you're sure that you don't need your firearm out anymore, you're then going to go back through those steps to orient the muzzle back into the holster, placing it securely in there, and then re-engaging any retention straps or manually operated devices designed to keep the firearm in the holster. With this particular design, of course, that's automatic. So we've got our steps. Recognize, grip, bring the gun up out of the holster, orient towards the threat, extend through the ready position, engage the threat appropriately and efficiently as needed, come back into the ready position, assess, and then reholster carefully before we relax. We know that in a real critical incident, when you recognize a threat, you're most likely to orient your entire body towards it. The human body fights and moves much better that way, and of course we need to have our head oriented towards the threat so that we can learn as much as we can about it, both eyes focused on that threat at the recognition phase, if not throughout the entire critical incident. But there may be a time or a circumstance where you can't turn your whole body at recognition. Perhaps you have a family member or someone that you're trying to push out of the way and control when you've recognized a threat over here, or maybe this is a combative person that you're trying to protect yourself from, and then you realize there's a more lethal threat behind that you're going to have to engage with your firearm. At any rate, thank you, Brad, you may not be able to turn, and you want to be able to practice the ability to draw and present from the firearm as efficiently as possible to the side to engage a threat that may be 90 degrees or some variation thereof off to your side. So whatever the reason, when you need to present the firearm from the holster out to your strong side, you're going to be oriented towards the threat with your head, but maybe not have been able to turn your whole body. It's important to understand that that recognition phase is still going to be there. You need to integrate that into your training. Recognize, reach down and grip the firearm and come up out of the holster. Now to this point, the presentation is exactly the same as it was to the front. We've recognized, we've gripped, and we've come up. Remember, the next step is orient the muzzle towards the threat. Well, what we're going to do is just that. we're going to orient the muzzle towards the threat. We're not going to point the gun forward and swing it over to the threat. We're going to rotate the gun and then extend into our shooting position. Now notice that the firearm is canted along with my head. If my head were over here, the gun would be over here. If my head were straight up, the gun would be straight up. Quite often, when you turn to the side and lunge one-handed, your head is also going to be tilted a little. You want to make sure the relationship between your head and the gun stay consistent. It's this relationship that allows you good, dynamic, intuitive shooting ability accurately, consistently, regardless of your exact body position. Full extension with the head and the gun aligned properly. Come back in, and we're going to turn and face down range as we assess and reholster. In a real situation, we may need to reholster while that target that we had to shoot at was still downrange this way. We may have to come back in here and reholster safely, but on a training range, we're not going to want to do that. We don't want to point the firearm anywhere except downrange, so we're going to cheat that for an administrative safety point, and at the end of this drill, we're going to turn downrange to assess and reholster. This is a caveat to a safe training environment, which is incredibly important. Let's take a look and see how this looks full speed. That's presentation to the strong side. We also can take a look at what's going to happen if we have to go to the weak side and cross our body. Of course, we're going to recognize, we're going to come down and grip the firearm, we're going to bring it up out of the holster, and at this point, we're going to cross our body with the muzzle oriented down, out from our body at about 10 degrees. Most likely, we're going to lower our center of gravity and have our knees bend a little bit, and I like to think of this as coming across parallel to our thighs. The firearm comes across the body, we attain a one-handed or two-handed grip, extend the firearm out, and then fire the rounds we need to, bring the gun back into a ready position, assess, and reholster. Now the truth is that situation may be pretty rare, where you can't turn, but you can shoot to the weak side, one-handed or two-handed. But it's still something you may want to practice in a safe and controlled way in your training environment. As part of our preparation to be able to present from the holster in 360 degrees all around us, in the event that we can't turn our whole body to face our threat, we need to be ready also to present the firearm to the rear. And of course, we're going to be consistent and efficient with our technique. You're going to hear the same commands all over again. The first thing we're going to do is recognize our threat. Once we've recognized the threat, but we can't turn around for one reason or another, or maybe we find that it's easier to present to the rear as we're turning around, we're going to get our grip, we're going to bring the firearm up out of the holster, and again, we're going to, as efficiently as we can, get that muzzle pointed at the threat. As we extend, the firearm rotates in line with our head. When we reach extension, to the threat, and again, for safety of training, we're going to come back and assess facing our threat and reholster. Let's take a look at that at speed. One thing you're going to notice is the body does tend to turn if we're shooting in that direction as we extend. Again, picture a situation, maybe you're seated, maybe you're kneeling, maybe you fell down, maybe you're trying to get a family member out of the way or control them and get them in close to you to protect them. There's a reason you can't turn your feet, otherwise you would. Even if you can turn around, you might find that it's faster using this presentation technique to get shots into your threat before you can fully turn around. If I were walking this way and had a threat appear to the rear, I can get shots off much faster if I don't wait until I'm turned around and oriented towards the threat, but I actually shoot as I reach extension during that turning maneuver. Presentation in 360 degrees is a vital and realistic part of advanced firearms handling. If you can't confidently and consistently, efficiently present in 360 degrees, you may fumble the draw when you really need to get the firearm on a threat and he's not directly in front of you or you can't quickly turn to face him. This holster is incredibly convenient for secure carry and rapid presentation in the event of a critical incident where you need to use lethal force, but it doesn't lend itself well to being carried conveniently concealed unless you're wearing some kind of a coat or jacket. With the coat on, you can see that this firearm is completely concealed, as is the spare magazine I'm carrying on the other side. At this point, if I were to recognize a threat and need to present the firearm, I'm going to go through the same exact stages I was earlier without the coat, but I'm going to be sure that when I go to get my grip, after I've recognized the threat, I place my hand firmly against my body and sweep backwards, getting the coat out of the way. When I attain my grip, the coat's going to stay out of the way. I can bring the firearm up through the ready position, engage the threat, come back in and assess, and then reholster. It's important to realize that this is a simple maneuver. You don't have to make a big demonstration of throwing the coat out of the way or pinning it back or lifting it and holding it or anything like that. Just get your hand against your body, sweep the coat out of the way, unholster, present, engage, assess, reholster. Same process we went through earlier, but now we're doing it in a way that's more plausible. Let's take a look at a few other holsters that might also be easy to conceal and therefore allow us to carry a firearm in public legally for our defense. We're in another concealed carry configuration where I now have this pullover that covers the firearm because I've changed holster configurations. As I lift up the pullover, you'll see that I'm now carrying this firearm inside my waistband. This inside the waistband holster, this particular Kydex holster, is a personal favorite of mine, and it's a great way, and it's also a very popular way to carry a firearm conveniently. If you have a concealed carry permit and you do choose to carry a firearm, inside the waistband may be a consideration for you for a small or medium frame semi-automatic pistol. If you recognize a threat in this configuration, sometimes you can come in with your strong hand beneath the pullover, come up and attain your grip, remove the firearm from the holster, come out through the ready position, and engage the threat. When you go to reholster, you're most likely going to want to move the pullover out of the way with the weak hand and then reholster safely. Of course, depending on the clothing you're wearing, the exact location of the firearm on your body, the type of holster, your athletic ability and coordination, it may be a better option for you if you have this hand free to lift the pullover and then get your grip and come up through the ready position, engage the threat if necessary, and go through those same steps. With the inside the waistband holster, you're compromising a little on the efficiency of being able to get your grip conveniently, but at the same time, it's infinitely easier to carry concealed in a public environment. As mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different holster types out there. And while we're not here to talk about all the different holster options, we do want to make sure that we cover presentation from some of the more popular types. This particular leather holster holds a full-size firearm very close to the body and angles it in a way that's relatively easy to grip. When I reach back after I've recognized to grip this firearm, I'm going to bring my thumb over the top of the holster and push in on this thumb snap. That's going to allow me to get my good grip. Remember, we wanted to feed all of these retention devices when we get our grip before the firearm comes out of the holster. Then the firearm would come out of the holster, orient, come through, come back in. Again, with this particular firearm, we decock, we assess, and then we return to the holster. Now, this holster is not going to be as easy to reholster to as the Kydex, the plastic ones, which stay open. This particular leather holster, you might have to look down. You don't want to reach down and then cover your own hand, however, with the firearm if you were holding it open like this, as that's what would happen. We don't want to do that. That's not safe. We might look down, or if everything were all fished together here, we might go behind the holster and come forward to remove that strap out of the way and then insert the firearm down safely and securely. We want to make sure that strap isn't in the way of the trigger guard or any other part of the firearm when the firearm goes down into the holster. And then, of course, we'd immediately re-secure the firearm with that snap so that we can then either continue on with the situation, go on about our business if we didn't have to fire but we had unholstered, or maybe we just got to this point, rethought the situation, or the dynamics changed. We want to immediately go ahead and re-engage that retention. I see a lot of people on the ranges that are a little bit lazy about snapping and unsnapping. And once they've unsnapped the first time, they don't snap again. And they go through all their presentation drills and their practice. This is a really dangerous habit because you could get into a position where you start bringing that thumb against the body to draw the gun. And the reality is, when you're actually carrying this firearm for your defense, you're going to have it snapped. So you should always practice unsnapping it on your draw. talk for a minute about the tactical reload, quote unquote. You've probably read articles about it, seen it in training classes, maybe practiced it yourself. The idea between the tactical reload, as it's usually taught, is that somewhere in the middle of a fight, there's going to be a lull. There's going to be a moment when you realize your fight is still going on. There's a high likelihood of you needing to use your firearm, but you have an opportunity to top your firearm off, to go ahead and put a fully loaded magazine and retrieve your partially loaded magazine in case you need it later, but make sure that your firearm's at maximum capacity. I find that to be more strategic than tactical. If I'm being tactical, I'm immediately addressing my problems. If I'm planning for what's about to happen, that's more of a strategy. The name sticks, and it's already called the tactical reload. Let's take a look at how it operates first, and then we'll actually talk about when I think it's appropriate to train it and why I stress some other options. The scenario would be that I'm here in an environment not expecting a problem, and then I'm startled by a threat that's appropriate for me to respond to with lethal force. I react, I engage. So the idea being, I was in a critical incident. Maybe first threat went down, but I know there's another threat. Maybe that threat ducked behind a wall and I'm going to duck behind another wall, but I have to go that way, or he's coming towards me saying, I'm coming to get you. Whatever it is, I have a good reason to believe that although this moment I don't need to be shooting, I will probably have to shoot again in the near future. I know I've depleted this firearm from its maximum capacity, so the logic is that I'm going to think ahead strategically, get a full magazine, bring it up to the gun, take out the partial magazine, insert the full one, and keep this one handy, but not put it back in my magazine carrier because I wouldn't want to perceive it as a full one later. This now gives me maximum capacity in this firearm so that I can defend myself if I need to as this incident now continues to develop. Well, the problem is that doesn't happen very often. What does happen quite often in the real world, if the duration of the critical incident outlasts the capacity of your firearm, is that you shoot the slide lock. This is a critical incident. This is when I tactically need to be able to get rid of that empty magazine, get a new one in there, and shoot again. That's the most important thing to train. And that's why I stress the critical incident reload over the tactical reload in your training environment. One of the worst things that could happen would be to be in the middle of a dynamic critical incident and need to be shooting and have a gun that's empty. If you've emptied all the rounds in your particular firearm during a critical incident, obviously it would be a very serious situation to begin with. Standing there with an empty gun is not where you'd want to be. We're going to take a look at the most efficient way to reload your firearm during a dynamic critical incident. Of course, you'd be in the middle of that critical incident when your firearm locked open at slide lock to let you know that you're out of rounds and you need to reload. You know, oftentimes we see people on the training ranges that want to take and put their depleted magazine somewhere else and put a fresh magazine into the firearm so that they don't run out of rounds. Well, the problem with that is if you're constantly doing that, you won't get an opportunity, or at least not as many opportunities, to practice recognizing slide lock and recovering from it. It's an incredibly important thing to practice, and that's why we want to leave those depleted magazines in the firearm and experience slide lock as many times as we can so that we can practice this incredibly important skill, the critical incident reload. Put my safety glasses on. Of course, we're going to be on a safe range when we practice any kind of shooting. We have our eye protection, ear protection, and here we are in a position simulating the middle of a critical incident. A situation that's already developing where we've needed to use this firearm to defend ourselves or others. In a justified situation, we can articulate a threat, a reason to use lethal force to protect ourselves. And in the middle of that situation, the gun locks back. Immediately, I'm going to bring the gun back in close to my body, drop that empty magazine out, find a new one, insert it firmly into the magazine well, reach up, rack the slide, get a good two-handed grip, and if I need to, re-engage the target. If I don't need to, I'm going to reholster and continue on. That skill could save your life or the lives of others that you're trying to protect. And if you don't get a chance to practice it, you're out of luck. Let's break it down and look at all the individual steps very slowly, very precisely. I'm going to go ahead and take this empty magazine and just put a couple rounds in so I can again get back to that slide lock situation, which is what's going to happen in my worst case scenario. place the depleted magazine back into the firearm. Where you carry your extra magazine, by the way, is important to think about. When we're in training, we often see this here on the belt in a convenient place in the magazine carrier. But the reality is, if you carry an extra magazine in your pocket, you should train from your pocket. If you wear a jacket and it's in that pocket, train from that pocket. Train realistically and consistently with the way you would actually carry your firearm for self-defense to make your training more realistic. Again, we're in the middle of a dynamic critical incident. The situation's already developing. We wouldn't only have a couple of rounds in our gun, but we may only have a couple of rounds left in the middle of an incident, which gets us to slide lock. At this moment, the weak hand comes off the gun. The firearm comes back in as we manipulate the magazine release, and that magazine falls out. When the firearm reaches our ready position, we've already got the extra magazine in our hand. We bring it up efficiently along the body into the magazine well. Note that I'm not looking at the firearm during any of this. I'm probably looking downrange at my threat, or looking for family members, or looking for a place to escape and get away. Maybe this is the break I need at this moment to get out and not have to shoot again. But if I do have to shoot again, of course, I'm going to complete the reload by rotating my hand up onto the top of the semi-automatic pistol, pull back on the slide to release the slide lock, let go, chambering around, get my two-handed grip back, and if I need to, extend, touch, press, or perhaps when I finish that reload, I'm going to stay in my ready position and assess and decide I don't need to shoot anymore. Again, doing this slowly, smoothly, and methodically in a training area is great to get started, but eventually you're going to want to do it at speed. Again, I'm going to take my magazine with several rounds in it, place it in my magazine carrier area, take that empty magazine. Of course, I've got a round in the chamber for my reload, and this will give me an opportunity to, again, get back into the center of that simulated critical incident where I'm about to run out of rounds. When I reach slide lock, I'm going to go through a full speed critical incident reload. Of course, that time, I obviously needed to shoot again. It's important that when you're training to actually picture whether or not you need to shoot again. Don't have a pattern. Don't have a prediction of what's going to happen during your critical incident because you can't know. What's important is that when you shoot on a range and you're training for personal defense, you're picturing that gravest extreme where you need to shoot and there are no other options. Some of you at home may be wondering why I carry my magazines in this fashion. You may be used to seeing magazines with the bullets pointing forward. This is traditionally the way most people will carry their spare magazines when they wear them on the belt in a magazine carrier. I find it to be more efficient in terms of body motion, speed, and convenience, and to have the bullets pointed backwards. I'll show you why. If you look at me as I'm standing here with a firearm in my hand, this is a simulated firearm, obviously, I'm going to reach back and grab the magazine in this way, keeping my hand, elbow, arm all very close to my body. As I grab the magazine and pull it up and out, I come back along the same path and insert the magazine into the magazine well of the firearm. If I had my bullets pointing forward, it requires a much larger body movement, and I have to twist my elbow and arm away from my body. As I pull the magazine out, I then have to flip the magazine up into the magazine well. It can be done very fast, and if you practice it, it can be very easy. But again, I find bullets pointing backwards to be more efficient. It's also a consistent motion I'm doing on the other side of my body when I draw the firearm. I'm coming back, grabbing that magazine, inserting it into the magazine well. Next time you're on the range, give it a try and see what you think is more efficient.
Hi, my name is Brad Shoup and I'm an instructor here at Valhalla Training Center. I'm going to show you a recommended technique for reloading a revolver. So when you fired the last shot, your left hand's going to come off, go to the front of the gun, right thumb's going to hit the release. These two fingers come through, hang the pistol here, punch the release there. All the brass may not come out. You're going to pluck that one out, drop it on. Meantime, your right hand has gone for the speed loader. You've grabbed it, set it in, release, make sure the rounds are in, reestablish a strong hand grip, close this up, right back into your shooting grip.
We know that there's a significant chance that during your critical incident, when you have no option other than to shoot, you may not have both hands free. This hand may be holding a family member or a child, or trying to control someone else who is combative that you didn't need to shoot, opening a door, maybe talking on the phone. There could be anything going on that keeps you from being able to use two hands to shoot. Of course, that means you won't have two hands when you need to reload either. One-handed shooting is primarily the same as two-handed shooting, except that we're going to be doing something else with this hand. During training, it's important to realize that this hand isn't always going to be pinned against your chest or in your pocket or at the small of your back. It's important to try different positions while you're shooting with this hand so that you don't feel like you have to be in this position or any other one. The truth is, this hand's going to be busy doing something, and that's why you're shooting one-handed instead of two-handed. When you have your slide lock situation, you're going to follow the same procedure with the strong hand you would normally. Bring the gun back through the ready position and hit the magazine release so the magazine falls free. You may have seen a lot of advice about what to do with the gun at this point. What I like to do with the gun is very simple. Put it back in the holster. It's designed to hold the gun. It will hold it securely while your strong hand reaches around to find your spare magazine. Whether it's in a magazine carrier or in a pocket, in your front pocket, back pocket, jacket pocket, doesn't matter. You have to find it with your strong hand only if this hand is busy. Once you've retrieved the magazine, you're going to insert it firmly into the magazine well, reach up, remove the firearm from the holster, and at this point, again, we're going to train for a firearm that does not have an easy to manipulate slide release lever, and we need to manually rack the slide. One of the easiest ways to do this is to simply do it on your holster, either by hooking the ejection port, the rear sight, or the friction of pressing in against your holster if you have a leather or a nylon type holster. With these plastic Kydex holsters, it's very easy to rack the slide by hooking the ejection port, coming up through the ready position and re-engaging the target if necessary, or standing by in the ready position if it's not necessary, and of course you then have the option of reholstering. There are a lot of other options to rack the slide. We're going to go ahead and put our depleted magazine back into the firearm, and we're going to take a look at another one. Again, this hand is busy. This time I'm going to have it down low as if I was shielding a child or moving the child out of the way while I was having to engage with the firearm. At this point, I'm going to again come back in, let that magazine fall free, go back to the holster, find my magazine, put it into the magazine well. If your clothing gets in the way, you've just got to move it. That's a realistic situation you could get into. Come up. At this point, I'm going to take the unloaded firearm, drive the slide down into my leg using friction to rack the slide, loading the firearm so that I can re-engage, stand by in the ready position and assess, or, again, reholster. Another option is going to be to get that magazine, come back across, insert it in, pick the gun up, and while keeping the firearm pointed behind me, use my heel to activate the slide and re-engage the target, stand by in the ready position, and once again reholster. One-handed reloads are an important part of your advanced firearms handling and training. You should find ways to do it that work with your gear, with your firearm, with your body type, your athleticism, and remember to train realistically with your extra magazines in the right place. Now, with something like the kicking the slide technique, it's important to realize that that's not a science. There are some people that are going to be more or less athletic than somebody else on the range, and some people can find 12 different ways to get a firearm reloaded, and some people can find 2 that work for them. It's important to understand the basic physics of that concept. Anything that comes into contact with that slide and moves it rapidly or forcefully in a rearward direction is going to release the slide lock lever and allow it to travel free. So whether it's your foot, your leg, your holster, a desk, a wall, a car door, find something to jam that slide against, push it rearward, and immediately let go and clear it so that you can get the firearm back into operation with a one-handed reload or malfunction clear situation.
In a situation where we may have to take a one-handed shot, whatever that might be, left hand's busy doing something else, again, if we run empty, what do we do if we can't use our left hand to reload a revolver? We take shots here, gun fires, becomes empty, we open this up. Here again, punching the button with a strong thumb, pushing the cylinder out with the trigger finger. Use whatever you need to hit that extractor and drop that brass out. Here again, you got to do what you got to do to get the brass to come out. You may have to hit it again. Now the gun is clear. Turn it, stick it in your belt. You can stick it back in the holster. Go for your speed loader, whether it's in a pocket or whatever. drop it in here, release, load, make sure it's full, gun comes out, close the cylinder, back up on target.
In the event that you are shooting with your weak hand only, and this hand is obligated to do something else, or more than likely, if you're shooting with your weak hand, this hand is injured and not being able to be used, you may also encounter a reload situation, and you're going to have a technique and a pattern, a consistent, efficient way of reloading the firearm from slide lock with your weak hand only. Again, we were in the middle of a critical incident. We ran out of rounds. The gun went to slide lock. As we come in, we're actually going to take the fingers, maybe the trigger finger or a middle finger from that hand, and hit the magazine release. You'll have to experiment with your firearm to find out which is more comfortable. As I come back through the ready position with the unloaded pistol, I'm going to reholster it backwards. Most of your modern Kydex holsters will allow this. Leather holsters may or may not. Nylon holsters the same. Again, experiment with your gear. This is just another advantage of this Kydex type of holster, because it allows you to leave the gun relatively securely in that holster while you're moving to cover, trying not to make anything worse, or simply going through your lateral movement and your reload procedure. As you insert into the magazine well, you're going to drive it back in, being sure not to push the firearm out of the holster. You're going to bring the gun back out of the holster, and again, you can use the holster and the ejection port to rack the slide, come back through the ready position, re-engage your threat if necessary. If not, stand by in the ready position. Again, I don't recommend that you reholster a loaded firearm with your weak hand only. When it comes to semi-automatic firearms for personal defense, there are a lot of good, reliable choices that are affordable, and you can probably find one that functions well in your hand and fits everything in your life appropriately for you to have available for your own personal defense or the defense of your family. If, however, you happen to have a malfunction while you're shooting in the middle of a critical incident, when you need to fire a firearm to defend yourself or your family, you're going to need to know how to clear that malfunction and get the gun working again. We're going to look at some efficient ways to clear a malfunction, get the firearm up and running again to protect you in the middle of that critical incident. What I've done is I've taken an empty cartridge and placed it inside the magazine that's currently inside my firearm, so that while I'm shooting, I'm going to incur a malfunction. Depending on what type of malfunction it is going to dictate how I respond to it. Let's see what happens, and then we'll go through an appropriate malfunction drill to clear that malfunction. As you can see, we have a failure to go into battery. All right, what we have is a failure to feed. If we take a good look inside the chamber, we'll see that we have a round stuck between the magazine and the inside of the chamber. The slide is not fully locked open, but it is out of battery. This is our first indication that something's wrong. If we were to, however, perceive this as a slide lock situation and the firearm being empty, we'd obviously go through the beginning of our reload drill. Our hand would come off the gun. We'd hit the magazine release. If the magazine fell free, we'd continue with our reload. As we came back, drew our magazine, inserted into the magazine well firmly, reach up and over, grab the slide, pull back and release. The gun's up and running. I can re-engage the threat if necessary, or stand by and continue to assess the situation. In this case, our malfunction drill was very simply a reload. Let's take a look at another option. In this case, I've pulled the trigger and nothing has happened. Failure to fire while the gun's in battery and we presume we have a loaded magazine will result in a very quick malfunction drill where we tap the magazine to make sure that it's inserted fully, rotate our hand up, grab the slide, pull back, get back into a firing position, either one-handed or two-handed, and re-engage the threat if necessary. That kind of malfunction can be caused by a lot of different things. Maybe a light strike on the primer, maybe a bad round in the first place, or obviously we're hitting that magazine because it may be that the magazine wasn't fully inserted for some reason or was knocked loose during a shooting situation where we had a bad grip. If, for instance, the magazine's not fully inserted and I go to shoot, I'll get one round off, but the second one will just be a click. The second time I pull the trigger will just be a click because the magazine wasn't inserted. My malfunction drill is to hit that magazine, rack the slide, chambering around, and then re-engage the target if necessary. That's a type 1 malfunction, the first malfunction drill we're going to deal with that doesn't look like a reload. Tapping the magazine, reaching up, racking the slide, and then, if necessary, re-engaging the threat. Having a snap cap like this, something that is an inert round but also will protect your striker or firing pin, to chamber in the middle of a drill is incredibly important to be able to train for these type 1 malfunctions so you can quickly check that magazine insertion, rack the slide, assessing constantly, and if you need to, re-engage the threat. Now we have another type of malfunction. This malfunction is known as a double feed. As we can see, there's a round still in the chamber because it failed to extract for one reason or another, maybe a broken extractor on the gun or a torn rim on the case, and another round is trying to get into the chamber. This creates a situation where, again, the firearm may look like it's at slide lock, so we might start this as a reload. As we come back in, we hit the magazine release and nothing happens. The reason nothing happens is because the friction between the magazine and the gun is caused by this round that's partially trying to chamber, maybe on the feed ramp or hung up on the bottom of the chamber itself, jammed against something other than the actual magazine, and therefore it won't release. That's our first indication that something's wrong. We'll be stopping our reload at that point when nothing happens, going back to the gun. We're going to try to release the magazine. If it doesn't come out, we can try to rip it out or we can lock the gun open. Traditionally, we'll want to make sure we do it. We'll lock the gun open, rip this magazine out, and then rack the slide several times to eject that one round that was stuck into the chamber. Shake the gun, check the gun. When we know it's clear, we then come back with our fully loaded magazine, rack the slide, and that gives us the ability to re-engage or to stand by in the ready position. In the event that you can't remove that magazine by tugging on it and pushing in on the magazine release, you're going to need to release the pressure that's being created by the slide trying to push that other round into the already full chamber. The way to do this is simply to grab the top of the slide, pull back. You're using that strong shooting hand thumb to push that slide lock lever or slide release lever up into the slide, the notch that's designed to hold that slide open with that device. If your firearm doesn't have one of these levers prominently on the side of the gun where you can reach it easily to lock the slide open in the event of a type 2 malfunction, you're going to need to figure out how you would lock the slide open on your particular firearm. This skill could be incredibly important and happen in a very bad time. Knowing how to lock your slide open so that you relieve the pressure on the magazine from the slide, once the slide is locked open, you can then push the magazine release button. Hopefully the magazine will just fall free. Afterwards, you're going to reach up, grab the slide, manipulate it vigorously to clear anything out of the chamber area, the chambered round that was in there before, or anything that may have become obstructed and be blocking the whole mechanism of the firearm from going into battery when you go for a new magazine. This should be done quickly with the gun canted towards the right, where the ejection port cutout is usually the largest. Being able to clear anything quickly is important so that you can get a new magazine into the firearm, rack the slide again, and if appropriate, re-engage your threat with the firearm, or stand by and assess the situation, or possibly, if the critical incident has ended, simply reholstering, reporting the incident to the authorities, and staying safe. Also, while shooting, you may encounter something like this, traditionally known as a stovepipe. This malfunction happens when you have an expended cartridge that doesn't get completely out of the way of the slide, causing the slide to get jammed up, not going into battery, not chambering the next round. You may or may not see this when you're at extension, but as you can see, it certainly is pretty prominent when there's a cartridge sticking out of the side of the firearm. If you're looking through the gun at your target or looking at your sights, you're probably going to notice. At any rate, once the firearm is brought back into the ready position, you're going to reach up and over, and instead of going behind the ejection port where we normally go, we're going to come in front and sweep our hand across, grabbing that as we grab the slide. That round falls out. We may eject a round, we may not. What we want is to get that slide back into battery. Of course, it's also possible that you would not have the use of both hands to clear a malfunction. If you were using a flashlight or on the phone or holding a family member behind you or something of that nature when you encountered a malfunction, if it's a type 1 malfunction and relatively easy to fix with a tap, rack, and assess, or a tap, rack, and re-engage, certainly you can do that one-handed. We're going to look at that next. There are other malfunctions that may be too complex to clear in any efficient way one-handed. If there's any way you can get this hand back into operation so that you can use it to manipulate the firearm, clear the obstruction, lock the slide open, whatever it is you have to do, rip the magazine out, you're going to want to do it. In the event that you can't, we're going to take a look at one-handed malfunction clearing now. Again, we're in the middle of a critical incident where we had to fire, we had no other option, we've engaged the target with several rounds, and in the middle of that, we have a click, we have a failure to fire. We're going to do the same procedure we did before, tapping the magazine on some hard, firm surface, our belt, our thigh, maybe our knee. Then we're going to rack the slide, again, trying to use the holster or our belt. If we slip off and we go down to our leg, we might be able to do it with friction, or we can again use our boot to lock that open. If we then have a failure to go into battery, it's again another failure. We jam on the magazine to make sure it's seated. We come back to our holster, where now, because the gun's out of battery, it's going to be much easier to hook that ejection port, rack the slide, come back up to our ready position. If we need to re-engage the target, we do so. If we encounter another malfunction, this again has an open battery malfunction. We're going to tap the magazine to make sure it's seated. This time I'm going to use my belt buckle on that open ejection port, and I'm going to rack the slide vigorously against it, trying to clear the chamber. That unexpended round did clear. I'm back in battery. I'm again ready to assess or re-engage if necessary. The end of my critical incident, I can then stay in the ready position and assess or reholster. So we've talked about the method and the technique for actually doing your critical incident reload, but what we haven't talked about is the best way to train that on your particular range. We're here on the square range at Valhalla, and I've got my magazines loaded with our frangible ammunition. And what I've done is I've set up a few different types of targets to represent different target areas, different target sizes. Remember, we want to always work on our balance of speed and precision, and that means shooting at targets of different sizes, different distances, under different conditions, so that we can get a more accurate account of our own personal ability, and therefore act with confidence appropriately and efficiently in a critical incident if we actually have to shoot in defense of ourselves or others. What I've done with these magazines this time is loaded them with a different number of rounds. They're loaded with between 2 and 5 rounds. I've got several magazines in my magazine holder and in my hand. And what that's going to allow me to do is to fire multiple shot strings at various targets and not be able to predict exactly when I'm going to have a slide lock reload situation, but to at least know that it's going to happen frequently. By doing this, I can get many more opportunities to practice my reloads out of a box of 50 rounds. Of course, if you're not very creative but very industrious, you could get 49 reloads out of a box of 50 rounds, and a lot of spare magazines. But what we're going to do is go ahead and make it less predictable. By putting 2 to 5 rounds in each magazine, we might get 10 to 15 reload opportunities out of every box, but they're not going to be predictable. And that's the real trick here, is learning to recognize exactly when that slide lock happens, but not doing it because you're counting rounds on a square range. Do it because of the way we feel differently when the rounds don't chamber and the slide stays back. When the slide stays back, we're going to go into our standard reload drill we've talked about, and of course we're going to integrate lateral movement if appropriate tactically, and we're going to do that in this drill, is integrate lateral movement while we're doing our reloads. Not only have I loaded these randomly, but I'm also going to place them randomly in order, so I don't know that it's 2 and then 4 and then 5. I've actually been holding these for a while, switching them around. We don't know what's what. Put a couple of these in my back pocket. I've got one in my magazine carrier, and now I'm going to place one in the firearm. And of course, we're going to load tactically every time. We're not going to do an administrative load when we're training for a tactical exercise. I'm going to stand by in the ready position first and just put some rounds into various targets downrange. When I have a slide lock situation, I'm going to go ahead and do my reload and assess and decide whether or not I need to shoot again. This time I'm going to go for my holster, and between strings of fire, if I carry a magazine carrier normally, and that's where I'm going to be doing my reloads from, it's important to go ahead and stage my next magazine, downloaded magazine for reload practice, back where it's going to be when I actually need to go for it. I'll do the next drill from the holster. So that time after the reload, I decided to go ahead and re-engage a separate target. It's important, if you reach slide lock in a training environment, to always go through that reload drill. Even though I intellectually knew I didn't have any other spare magazines, the chances of that happening in a real situation are probably pretty slim. If I normally carry extra magazines, I would go for one of those extra magazines. In this situation, what I want to do is go through that exact reload drill as if I had a magazine. And if nothing else, at least I'm presenting a plausible threat at this point, not standing here saying, I'm out of ammo, which isn't going to help me at any event. Go to slide lock. Plan B is going to be whatever it's going to be, but do it with a plausible threat. And the other thing we talked about was our malfunction techniques, a way to clear malfunctions, different types of malfunctions. Of course, in order to get training opportunities, we will have to create malfunctions. Most of our firearms, hopefully, that we're using for self-defense or that we're prepared to use for self-defense aren't going to malfunction very often in a realistic training environment. So we're going to induce malfunctions. One of the easiest ways to do that is to take one of these empty cartridges and load it in along with live cartridges in your magazines. This obviously will cause at least a failure to fire and quite possibly a failure to feed, depending on the type of firearm you're using and whether or not it feeds. The other thing you can do is take one of these snap caps that we looked at earlier. These will cause a failure to fire, possibly a failure to feed also, so putting them in the mix. And then what we're going to do is, just like we did with the reload situations, is we're going to do that randomly. So we've got a few magazines. I've got one in the firearm already. I've got one in my hand that's loaded, and I'm going to go ahead and complete the loading situation with this, with the snap caps and with the empty cartridges mixed in. The idea is that we don't want to know when that need to reload, the need to clear malfunction is going to happen. But when it happens, we're going to go ahead and prepare. So again, we're going to mix these up. We don't know which is which. Put one of them in the magazine carrier. We'll save one of them for later. We've got one in the firearm already. Check and make sure that the firearm is loaded. And now that it is, we're going to go ahead through our firing drills again. So what you saw there was a series of malfunction drills followed by a reload drill. Obviously, when you're in the middle of one of these drills, the malfunctions and reloads are going to come more often than they would during a real situation, and you have to react to what you have. When you get into the pattern of constantly practicing reloads or constantly practicing malfunction drills, what's going to happen is you'll end up mixing the two together. As you saw, when I brought that firearm in and tapped, I realized that it was an open slide lock situation, fully out of battery. When I realized that, I immediately switched to a reload drill. That's going to be part of your process. Imagine yourself in a real critical incident where you did have a failure to fire, or even two, for any reason. The gun malfunctioning, the gun being dirty, the gun obstructed, or just perhaps a bad lot of ammunition. Anything can happen in a realistic situation. If you've had to do 2 or 3 malfunctions in a magazine, when you do get slide lock, you may automatically go into that malfunction drill, which is what you just saw here. Part of training is to avoid that kind of repetition as often as you can, but create situations where you can train often enough to make the training worthwhile. Everything's a balance. When you come out to a training range, you need to be prepared to find the most realistic ways that you can train without causing unrealistic patterns. Let's go back to the drill. Obviously, you wouldn't want to do that for an hour straight. It's too much emphasis on something that's not likely to happen, that malfunction drill. Practicing your reloads and your malfunction clearing techniques on your range is incredibly important. Don't overemphasize it, but don't neglect it either. When you go to a range and you set up your targets downrange, and if all you do is stand there and stand still and shoot two-handed, you may be making yourself a better shooter. You may be making yourself a better defensive shooter. But to be the best defensive shooter you can be, you really need to be able to take a lot of these shots one-handed also. And you're going to want to know your ability in case you're in a realistic situation where you only have one hand to shoot with. So we're going to do some strong-handed, one-handed shooting here on the range and see what happens. Of course, whenever you shoot on the range, you want to make sure you vary your strings of fire, just like you would with two-handed shooting. You're going to apply all the same drills, all the same fundamentals, target areas, different types of targets, different types of mixes of commands or perceptions in your head, thinking of recognizing a threat and responding appropriately, always thinking about why you're shooting. We're not just shooting to shoot, we're shooting because someone's trying to hurt us. And in this particular case, someone's trying to hurt us and this hand isn't able to be used to help shoot. Maybe it's pushing a family member out of the way, or maybe it was holding a flashlight. Whatever the reason, we're going to shoot one-handed. Of course, it doesn't hurt to practice your reloads one-handed also. Maybe we had two hands on the gun and we decided to move that family member out of the way. Whatever the situation is, you need to be thinking always in your head why it's realistic. Why do you need to fire? When you're doing your firearms handling training with the intent of preparing yourself to defend you or someone you care about, keep in mind that these targets aren't just targets. You're actually supposed to be perceiving them as the threat. Remember, when you recognize a threat, you're going to need to make the choice about whether or not it's appropriate to shoot, how fast you can shoot. If you have no other option and you need to shoot, you need to know your ability, and that means recognizing the situation from your training. One-handed practice, two-handed practice, any practice you do on the range should be appropriate to a realistic defensive situation.
Thanks for watching this edition of the Personal Defense Network DVD series. Practice the tactics and training skills you've just learned at your favorite shooting range, and you're going to gain the confidence and skills you need to effectively protect yourself with your firearm. Remember to check and understand the firearm laws in your area, especially as they relate to personal protection and concealed carry. See you next time.
You know, it's often said that eyewitness account or firsthand testimony is the worst type of evidence to present in court, but we can learn a lot from it when we put it in context for tactical training and for defensive training of ourselves and our families for firearms use or even just general awareness and safety. So when we talk to someone who's been through a real critical incident, it's important to look at it both with a filter for logic and reason to see if it makes sense, and in fact to challenge them to let us know how it was affected by their training beforehand and afterwards. Let's take a look at what Jeremiah Miles has to say about a critical incident he was in while serving our country in a special operations team.
I was a member of the military special operations looking for high-value targets in and around Baghdad. Our job was to search the house and capture a high-value target for intelligence gathering purposes. 15 guys in the stack. I was the number one man. We breached the door, which took longer than expected. Threw a flash grenade into the room. It was a dud. So we entered the first room, which was like a foyer deck kind of area, covered deck if you would. And the next room we went into, I was once again the number one man. As I button hooked to the left in the center of the room, I saw a flash, which zeroed me in on a man shooting at me. He had a 1911. First few rounds went through the gun, which significantly affected the target's ability to present a lethal threat. By that time, we had 4 guys in the room. There's no longer a threat in the center, so I finished my sweep to the left. There was a man with an AK-47 proned out. So by that time, we had 4 guys in the room. Everybody engaged, the guy with the AK-47. So obviously, we were ambushed. We were hunting. It was night. We had we had the flashbangs, we had the momentum, but we were ambushed. That's a big thing that military, especially now, has on their side, is they're hunting. They're not ambushed. But really, if you're not expecting somebody to shoot you in a room, you were ambushed. I think that the bad guy, the carjacker, the guy who's going to rob you, break into your house, already has a plan. They know what they're going to do. You have to react to their actions. You're not the aggressor, you're ambushed, the ambushee, if you would. So in that ambush moment when we were caught off guard, I realized that certain things will happen. Obviously, the tunnel vision, I saw the flash, saw the gun, tachyphylaxia, time seemed to slow down for me. Lowering the center of gravity, orienting toward the threat. All of these things I experienced firsthand from this critical incident. So I think it's important to work with those in training, whether it's in a shoot house or just on a flat range, is to work as intuitively and efficiently with those instincts as you can, which will make you more efficient in a critical incident when you are ambushed.
As we see, it's not always the preparation that's most important about a critical incident in terms of our training. It's the aftermath. It's taking what we learned or what we experienced and applying it critically to see if our training really prepared us for it or if we should augment and change our training in the future. And that's a valuable lesson that Jeremiah shared with us, and I hope you take it back into your training when you prepare to defend yourself or your family.